And so I think my sense is that there's a majority in this case of 3-1 affirming a trial court below for a better reason, and that's because whatever somebody may have intended in 1986, it wasn't made adequately clear. And fundamental constitutional rights shouldn't be eviscerated by assumption or implicit amendment. Now, so maybe there's an opportunity here in the future for somebody to advocate that let's go back and get it right this time. And maybe that'll happen. I don't know. But I think that's what resulted in this decision. And that's why I think the balance was struck in the appropriate way in this case. As for what you do about a legislator who is perceived to have or does in fact use his or her office for personal economic gain, I don't know, and I agree that that's an admirable goal. But as it currently exists, as the law exists in Rhode Island today, and as it has existed in Rhode Island and the United States for hundreds of years, to do so by attacking their vote or their deliberations or their participation in core legislative activities just isn't going to work and is not a satisfactory mechanism.
So, Mr. Friel, I want to push you a little bit farther on the legislative significance of legislative history. If this was a conflict between two vibrant and important, difficult to resolve ideas, why was there no discussion in the Constitutional Convention about speech and debate? And why does it seem that the legislative history is all in favor of it being inclusive?
Well, I don't know that I can entirely answer that question. I will tell you one thing, though, that gets referenced in the Supreme Court's opinion, which is that when the Ethics Amendment was passed in 1986, the speech and debate clause, among other aspects of the Constitution, were re-ratified. So there was a reaffirmation of the intent for them to remain intact, which I don't think is an insignificant detail. I think that's important. But if your question is shouldn't the balance be struck in a different direction, given that there was so much discussion of the importance of enforcing the ethics laws and no sense of an equal or greater emphasis on speech and debate? Maybe, except that, again, I go back to the idea, and we cited a number of examples in our brief file with the court, of cases in which the U.S. Supreme Court has repeatedly said constitutional rights and constitutional provisions should never be implicitly repealed or limited. It has to be expressed. There's a way you amend the Constitution. If you want to do it, that's how you should do it.
And we'll get to that in just a second. One more question about the opinion.
To what degree does the fact, I assume, that in 1986 we did not have separation of powers in the Rhode Island government, to what degree is that responsible for the fact that only in Rhode Island we have an ethics commission set up the way it was set up? Is the fact that presumably now we have decided that Rhode Island will balance its government, will join the rest of the states and the federal government in having 3 co-equal branches of government. Does that change in the governmental structure in Rhode Island affect what was perceived in 1986 as the need for this unique in the nation ethics commission with judicial power? And if so, how did they do it in all the other 49 states? Thank you.
Mr. Bender?
Well, you had basically 2 questions there. The first part is how would the new separation of powers amendments, did they have any impact on this decision, or would they have any impact? I don't think they necessarily had any impact on this decision. The speech and debate clause is not a civil right per se. And it said this in the opinion. It is a structural separation of powers. It's to keep the executive from interfering with the legislature in the functions of its duties. The separation of powers amendments, though, particularly the amendment to where it determined that we want to have 3 separate departments. Because of the emphasis on separation of powers, that again makes me more concerned about the issue I talked about before, whether or not the court, if it revisited the question of whether or not the Ethics Commission has the authority to enact substantive ethics legislation without the approval of the General Assembly. If that question would be revisited again, the fact that there is this more definite separation of powers might just add more weight to the argument, because the template that the court used to essentially dismiss the implied repeal argument can be used exactly with respect to the power of the Ethics Commission to enact substantive legislation. It's a question of whether or not they, that issue will arise again, and whether or not they would be, willing, as they indicated in the opinion, to actually revisit that particular issue. That was a hotly contested issue at that time, and there were proponents that were vigorous on both sides of it, and I'm sure would be vigorous on both sides of it again. So I think separation of powers doesn't have an effect on this decision, but it could have an effect in the future.
Anyone have something to add? Okay. Then let's move on, and Mr. Friel's remarks sort of invite us to look to the future and decide, what should we do now? Should we go back and make it clearer, or maybe that's not a good idea? We have 2 people who are going to speak for, I hope, about 5 minutes on that question. We'll start with John Marion, who's Executive Director of Common Cause Rhode Island, a nonpartisan advocacy group focused on creating more open, ethical, and accountable government. Prior to his current position, John was a longtime graduate student in political science at Indiana University, and he adds, unlike everyone else on the stage tonight, he did not attend law school. And then we'll hear from John Roney, who served 4 terms in the Rhode Island Senate, retiring in 2003. He's an attorney and former president of the Rhode Island Bar Association. He has prosecuted cases for the Ethics Commission, including the case against former Governor DePrete, and he has represented clients before the commission. He's currently the parliamentarian of the Senate and advises senators and staff on ethical issues. Mr. Marion.
Thank you. I want to thank Ross for moderating and all the panelists for participating, taking time out of their careers, their billable hours, to come and do this. And for many of them, their concern about these issues extends beyond their careers, and it's commendable what they do. And on all sides of the issue. And I want to thank everybody for attending, for coming out tonight and showing your interest in this topic. And finally, I want to thank everybody for roughly keeping to the time limits. I know that was a concern. Common Cause Rhode Island does support and expressed, if I have the term correct, expressed repeal of the speech and debate clause, but one that is limited in nature. As Mark said so aptly, let's get it right this time. I think that could be our slogan. We feel that in 1986, not only did the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, but the voters who ratified their product intended for all elected officials to be subject to the entire code of ethics in all of their capacities. And so we support amending the Constitution, asking the General Assembly to allow the voters to amend the Constitution in 2010 by putting language on the ballot that would do that. As you came in, most of you should have received some language